Welcome to today's show. You're listening to So Here's the Thing podcast, a podcast covering various topics that can cover just about any topic. Today's episode is from the Auditory Bookworm playlist, where we review and discuss books that have been recorded as audiobooks. Many people are auditory learners and readers, and this review is to help those discover other books and topics that are done audibly. Today's episode is covering the book The Master Plan, My Journey from Life in Prison to a Life of Purpose, written by Chris Wilson. This book, if it's not given away by the title, is more of an autobiography written by the author himself. It was published in 2020 by Penguin Publishing Group. The audio version is also done by Penguin, and it has an unabridged audiobook on Audible. A little bit about Chris Wilson's history prior to writing this book. Chris was born and raised in Washington, D.C. He grew up under extremely difficult circumstances, from poverty, drug addiction, and gun violence. They were everyday norms for him and his community. At the age of 17, he was charged with a crime, convicted, and sentenced to a natural life in prison. It was during a time of isolation that he decided not to only turn his life around, but to make a difference in the life of people who currently lived in poverty-stricken communities, similar to the childhood surroundings. Many years ago, he committed his life to self-improvement and helping others. He sat in a dark cell and he came up with what he now calls his master plan, a plan on building a business empire and helping others. While he was in prison, Chris was able to earn his high school diploma, graduate from all the vocational shops available. He earned an associate's degree in sociology and taught himself to speak and write in several different languages. He became a mentor. He started a career center. He opened a book club, and after serving 16 years in prison, he would return to society as a changed man. So the book starts out with Chris describing his life early on, living in Washington, the struggles he had, and actually the start of it, he doesn't actually have that many struggles. It doesn't seem like at first, but in my opinion, in my thoughts, I raised the question, was this viewpoint of his mom being perfect more of a self-wish of a young child, or was it the reality that later changed? I say later changed because she later met a gentleman listed in the book known as the Cop. He became a stepdad of sorts towards Chris, but he was very abusive and controlling of the mom. He didn't approve of Chris very well. Chris ended up living with his grandma for much of his childhood, and his grandmother gave him advice just to keep your head down and avoid all these problems. Chris went on to later start running around with a little bit of a rougher crowd. Never really got into the gang lifestyle, but in his writings he was around certain people that probably shouldn't have been around. That led him to make a fateful decision where he shot a gentleman in the back who was actually committing a crime against him. And in many instances, this could be considered a self-defense act. How the book writes it, it almost sounds like it's a self-defense at first, except the man was shot in the back as he was running away after he attacked Chris. Chris was therefore arrested, charged, and convicted of murder and sentenced to prison. This is in the early 90s, and the Rodney King incidents in Los Angeles. Also, the governor of the state put a order down of no leniency towards offenders, no matter the age. This ended up leading Chris to a time where he was sentenced to jail for life. Before we start speaking about Chris's jail life and his time in his incarceration, let's look back on his earlier time frames. From the book, he writes, The only white people we ever saw in Lincoln Heights were cops, and those cops hated us. They were trying to keep us down. All they did was eyeballs, harass us, and make us feel like criminals, even though we were kids. Then suddenly they would barrel down the road, 20 at a time, in a six-wheeled combat vehicle, battering down doors and throwing everyone on the floor. This is from page 14 and 15 of the book. From that, you're taking the idea that the only time that these folks in this neighborhood would see a white person is if they were cops and law enforcement. And this is during a time that racial animosity was still extremely high, with things going on in LA and around the country of racial diversity. You've got young black men being targeted by cops, and even if they weren't being truly targeted, that's how they felt, because that's all that they could see it as. Where that possibly is not always true into the case, that's the perception that was given to these youth at the time. While racial tensions were high, this is also the time frame of the war on crime, quote unquote. This had profound effects on how police did their practices at the time. Drugs were the enemy. They were targeting those that were using drugs and that were selling drugs, and a lot of times those ended up being in the communities that couldn't be on the higher end of the neighborhoods. They often targeted black people due to the fact that a lot of the times they would associate the drug use with just the black communities, while drugs were a problem across the board. I also think that, the use of their militarized vehicles isn't really a problem as much. I see that as more of a systematic use of resources that is a various valuable tool towards law enforcement. While it may seem scary to the citizens and the public, that equipment is designed to take on gunshots and attacks which law enforcement face when they are often going after these people that do use drugs and do try to sell. Chris describes how gang members would shoot each other in the street, but yet he doesn't describe how law enforcement is getting shot at the same time. When they're doing their job, they're needing to use the best equipment available. I see that there probably does need to be some reform done, and to address that kind of factions. The state of policing right now is one where the police are always the enemy. No matter what the circumstances or the call, the police are always saw as the bad guys. And that's not the true case. Majority of the police out there are trying to do a good job and trying to help the communities that they work and live in. They have no ill feelings towards any one person or any one race. They are just doing the best they can to help protect their community. Now, that doesn't say there isn't a few bad apples out there, but in that same argument, while there are a few bad cops that shouldn't be wearing the badge and shouldn't do the job, I can go to any fast food joint and find you a bad burger flipper in the same argument. I don't think that it's going to take one side being fixed to correct the problem. I think it's going to take a whole culture and a whole change of mentality that one side isn't a victim and one side isn't the perpetrators. I think everyone needs to sit down and discuss the best options there. Crime is going to happen regardless of race. Crime is most generally led by greed and by hate. Those two things lead to crime to happen. When you're talking about drugs, or you're talking about burglaries, or you're talking about property crimes, a lot of it is to do with drugs or money, because people are greedy. That's what it comes down to. It's greed. Um, Law enforcement constantly sees this. They constantly see that negativity out in the world, and they have to review where they're coming from. I think in Chris's instances, um, he was living in what they call the projects often. Lincoln Heights is a well-known project type neighborhood. Low income, which often is the case for minority families. And that often brings in crime to come in because these low income families have to sometimes commit crimes to survive. Well, that makes the officers that respond and work in that area see everyone as criminals. While that shouldn't be the case, they're also in turn, all the citizens there, whether they're criminals or not, are seeing the cops as the bad guys. That's not the case for either side. There are good people on both groups, and it shouldn't be a matter of color versus law enforcement or a race versus race. We should all be striving to make the world a better place and making our communities a lot safer and better to live in. There's a lot worse people out there and a lot worse things going on than having the time to hate each other. I see Chris's interaction with law enforcement continuously throughout the book. Law enforcement being not only the cops on the streets, but the corrections officers he works around or lives around while he's in prison, as well as the court officers that he is around. Um, Not every cop he comes in contact with, he puts in a negative light, while some are in a negative light. You've got to look at the larger picture in a lot of this stuff and see that not everybody out there is an enemy. And I keep reiterating that because often that's what it feels like is we're in a giant war, which we shouldn't be in. This book and this time frame that Chris is describing is around the early 90s, and here we are in the 2020s, and we're dealing with the same kind of beliefs and ideas that racism is rampant. I disagree that racism is rampant. I believe that a feeling of that stems from a few bad apples on both sides. There's not one good innocent person all the way around. Everyone's committed crime or committed sin in some fashion. And regardless of your religious beliefs, you should treat people fairly and equally. There's nobody one body better than the next person. But the negativity towards the law enforcement is just one aspect that Chris faces. Another instance is the book is another aspect of seeing law enforcement where his mom is with a cop, and this cop is abusive towards his mother, and when they would try to get help by calling law enforcement, the cops would show up and immediately believe the other officer that whatever is going on is what the cop was saying, and that also put a negative light on law enforcement and cops for Chris. Chris describes this guy as an abuser. He punched Chris's mother to the point that she passed out and was unconscious. He pistol whipped Chris. He assaulted everybody in the house. And then when the cops did once in a while get called, they would just ignore it. Domestic violence is a prevalent problem regardless of the career and the person. Often the abusers have control tactics over their victims, not just the physical violence, but they might be the ones that are bringing in the money. They might be the ones that are utilizing other tactics and means of control, not to allow the victim to function in normal ways. Controlling who they get to see and who they get to be around, what they get to buy, and how they get to dress. There's a lot of psychological effects of that, and both experiencing it and witnessing it. Chris is actually a better statistic than some because the belief is there's a cycle of violence if it's not intervened, which in Chris's case, it kind of was intervened by him going to prison, but he witnessed this person assaulting his mother, someone that he held in a higher light in the early parts of the book, but as the chapters went on, she got a drug habit and started avoiding Chris and separating herself from Chris. The officer ends up causing all this violence in his life, and the perpetration of that is Chris sees violence as it's okay. While I don't believe that's in Chris's case, that's in a lot of cases. Violence brings on violence. The victim, in this case a young boy, such as Chris was, would see the violence done to his mother, and then down the road in his life would believe that that would be an okay action to continue. While it's not, their mental processing and their mental ideas are how they perceive them and how they were taught. Domestic violence isn't a good day for anyone. The victim is often scarred for life. While I'm not saying every person who experiences trauma, because everybody experiences a trauma differently, domestic violence can lead into PTSDs. People having issues and episodes into a depression, into a distress disorder. They handle the stress differently, but constant attacking or constant abuse and a constant trauma occurring to a person will cause that person to develop mental instabilities. So overall, the story from Chris over his master plan, he writes in his master plan, or at least as he describes the best he can remember of it, these are just simple ideas such as getting his GED, all the way to ideas of marrying a pretty girl and having a fast car. He writes down his plan, trying to figure out how to achieve that plan, both in prison and outside of prison. He has a goal in mind, and having a goal is an excellent thing. A wish, an idea without a plan is just a wish. So, having a goal, he's determined to reach that goal. Throughout the whole book, it is very well written. You can see that Chris uses his knowledge that he did learn through his education into describing the scenes throughout the book and describing the situations that are occurring in each chapter. He breaks the book down in those chapters to a category of whatever the topic may be. In the early parts, he was describing his early home life, and as he went through prison, he described those events. So the events throughout the book make it very interesting to listen to and have an inside view of how Chris was living during all this time. I think the book overall is a very well-rounded book. I would highly suggest it to anyone who's looking for a well-written, well-defined description of how, I would say, life is. Not everybody is able to articulate and put in words their meanings and their ideas and their thoughts. And throughout the whole book of the master plan, Chris is able to do this. Following this podcast, down in the description, if you're on the YouTube, you'll be able to find links to the books and the Audible books and where to purchase it and where to find it. The books themselves on Audible is pretty simple to find, depending on how you get your membership, either your credits or your money. Just Google or just search in the search bar on Audible the master plan. The cover of it itself has Chris on it. He's looking back at the camera in a more broken down neighborhood. Real big words, Chris Wilson. Should be easy to find on that. The hardcover book and the paperback are the same cover sheet, same description. They're found on Barnes & Noble for around $18 for the paperback and around $27 for the hardcover at the time of this recording. By no means are these the only two options to find the books, whether they be an audible version or in a written version. So, more than welcome to find other resources. At the end of this, I think this is going to be the end of the show for today. I hope you all have enjoyed this review of The Master Plan by Chris Wilson, and hopefully you get the chance to take down this knowledge from this book. So as for now, we're going to be signing out. I hope you have a wonderful day, and join me next time on the podcast. So here's the thing.